Okay. Okay, I think we can start. Hi, everybody. Today is our regular monthly session of DecisionCAMP. And as usual, the session would be recorded and we will upload it to our DecisionCAMP YouTube channel. We also have a Slack channel. This is a place, monthly session channel, where you can put all your questions. You already can type them. And today, our host is Dan Selman. And Dan is a well-known person in the decision management community. People who remember, for example, JSR 94 standard know that Dan was the author of this standard. And for many years, Dan was a product manager for, I believe, ILAC rules initially, and the IBM ODM. And approximately 4 years ago, Dan left IBM and started his new adventure with Clause software based on, as I initially understood, it was his main direction was blockchain, and they quickly became a main player in smart contracts movements. And today, Dan is a main force behind the open source framework for smart documents and agreements called Accord, and he would share his experience with us today. Dan, welcome. And
thank you, Jacob.
Take over.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's lovely to talk to the decision management community again. As you said, I've been on the part of and on the edge of decision management for what feels like most of my career. Yeah, today I'm going to talk about the work that we're doing in the Accord project, and I'm going to try to keep the slides to the absolute minimum, just set some context, and then I hope to show you a demo or two. So the Accord project is it's an open source top level project under the Linux Foundation. And to cut a long story short, one of the main problems that we work on is how can we take a legal contract and bind the text in that contract to some representation of logic via a data model. So we're working in the open. There's a pretty vibrant community around the Accord project where we get into the details of what parts of a contract can be digitized, how should they be digitized, and a lot of other interesting questions. So it's not directly decision management, but it's certainly sort of related in that you're trying to capture some human knowledge in a digital form. And often you want to make it available to kind of less technical or non-traditional users of some of this technology. I shall brush over this. It's a pretty mature open source project at this point. I mean, if you're curious, please just visit accordproject.org and you'll find a whole lot of information about the work we've been doing. As I said, pretty broad membership that comprises global law firms, smaller law firms, standards bodies, and technology companies, both large and small, including the company that I'm the CTO for, which is called Clause, which is not the focus of today. And yeah, a very lively Slack community. If you go to the accordproject.org, you can sign up for the Slack community. I think last time I checked, we had over 20,000 members signed up. So just a few pointers, sort of signposts to some of the technology that we build. The three sort of foundational components are called Cicero, Ergo, and Concerto. Cicero is sort of an umbrella. It allows us to capture what we call a template for a clause. And I'll show you some examples of that. So it's really about the natural language part of this problem. You know, how do you capture the natural language for a clause and start to parameterize it? Ergo is a domain-specific language that we use to capture the logic of a clause in a computational form. And Concerto is a domain-specific language that we use to capture data models. So concepts, relationships, entities, whatever you want to call them, that are sort of manifested in the text of the contract and that you might want to write logic about. And then there are some sort of repositories of end-user content that we maintain. One is a template library, some sample clause templates, and the other is the model repository, where people can create data models and share them, import them, reuse them across templates in a very open format. So just a little bit more detail. Concerto is essentially a schema language. You know, if you're familiar with XML schema or JSON schema, Concerto should be pretty quick to pick up. It's designed to be platform and platform agnostic and sort of internet scale, in that it's very easy to create Concerto models and then publish them to the internet and reuse parts of them, import other people's models, etc. And it has a very nice language for textual language for describing models, much less verbose than XML schema or JSON schema, for example. And it's really the sort of foundational part of the Accord Project ecosystem, in that we do a lot of model transformation and sort of model-driven user interface generation. And that is all essentially based on Concerto. And it's the type system for the Ergo language as well. Cicero is essentially this notion of a snippet of natural language text that has some variables embedded inside it. So it's, you know, having come from the business rules space, it's fairly different in that what we found when we started this was that, you know, the legal folks are really, really precise about the language that they want to use. So our feeling was it was not really possible to build a sort of a general purpose domain-specific language that would be suitable for inclusion in a legal contract. We really have to start with the legal text and then think about how we want to parameterize it by inserting variables. And that's the, you know, that's the genesis of Cicero. And as I said, Ergo is how we can describe the logic of a template. It's optional. Many templates don't capture their logic. They just capture their variables and the natural language. But you can go a step further and start to you know, attach code essentially that sits behind these templates so that they can respond to events that are occurring in the outside world. And that's where we start to get a little closer to traditional decision management, I think. Then there's a whole suite of kind of ancillary projects that help people use the technology, a VS Code extension, a set of web components that vendors can use to embed this technology into their vendor solutions, and many other things. But with that intro, I think I'll show you some of it in practice, and hopefully that will that'll make it a bit more concrete. So let me share my editor for a second. You know what, I'm just going to be lazy and share my whole desktop. I hope this is large enough. If you're having trouble seeing, please just shout. So what I did, kind of for fun, but I was also interested to see, you know, some of the recent work that that you lovely people have been up to is I took one of the challenges from the decision management website, which was this SaaS pricing challenge. And that's something that we see quite a lot at Clause, is people trying to digitize those kinds of contracts. And I just thought I'd walk you through how you would create a Cicero template to capture perhaps the legal text of that SaaS pricing clause. So basically, typically when we're building one of these templates, we would start with the legal text. So this could come from the procurement department, the contract management department, the legal department. They will have typically some existing legal text that they use. So we would start with that, so this might be an example of that. And then we will have a discussion about them that, well, there are clearly some variables in here. Some of these things will get negotiated when we're setting up one of these contracts. Maybe, where the tiers are, the size of the free tier, and obviously the names of the parties and the effective date of the contract will be negotiated or agreed upon. So from that discussion, we build what we call the grammar for the template, which looks like this. I can give you a little kind of WYSIWYG preview if you like. Let me wrap that. So we've introduced variables for the vendor name, the customer name, the effective date, the size of the free tier, and the cutoff points for the different tiers. So in this case, it's kind of hard-coded to be 3 tiers, but you could imagine that you could even support a variable sort of list of tiers. The templating technology is sufficiently powerful to handle that kind of thing. And then because you're talking about natural language, you can introduce some sort of formatting expressions here to say, well, this is the English version of this template. So I'm going to use commas as thousand separators for free units. The French version of the template would use periods as thousand separators. So the goal is that you can make this sample as close to the template grammar as possible. And once you've defined the template grammar, what you then need to do is you need to define the data model for this template. So these free units, tier 1 units, are variables, and there's a type system that can sit behind those variables. So in this case, I defined a model for this tiered service contract using Concerto. You can sort of get a graphical view of some of these models. But essentially, this is a very simple model. We've said that SaaS vendor is a string, SaaS customer is a string, effective date is a date, free units is a number. Tiered 1 rate is interesting. It's a monetary amount. So that's a complex type that has been imported from another namespace. And the rest are numbers and monetary amounts. So once we've set up the grammar and we've defined the model, essentially what the Cicero technology will do is it will generate a parser for us, which allows us to extract the model elements from essentially plain text. So I can now feed this sample.md into Cicero, and it will tell me what the contract variables are, if you like, from this free text. So let me do that on the command line. I'm inside the SaaS pricing template, and I've installed the Cicero command line tools. This is the latest version, 0.21.9. And if I type Cicero parse, what it's going to do is it's going to generate a parser from the grammar and the data model, and it's going to feed that sample.md file into the parser, and it's going to spit out, well, an instance of that model essentially that we defined. So we now know that the SaaS vendor is Clause Inc., the SaaS customer is Acme Corp, and where the various cutoffs and thresholds are. And this is really useful because it allows us to store this text as our system of our system of record for that clause. We don't have to store some ugly JSON representation of the clause data. So that's the parse route, which allows us to convert from text to data. But we can also go in the other direction. So if I do Cicero draft, I can basically say, given some of that data, so this data.json, so an instance of that template, could you draft it into HTML form, for example, and there are other formats that support it. So I'm going to draft this data.json into an HTML document where we're doing the reverse transformation. So now if I open that draft.html, we get a nice kind of pretty printed HTML rendering of the template, and that's what we'll use during, say, a contract assembly when we send this contract out for signature. So fundamentally, the technology is allowing us to do this bi-directional data binding between modeled contract data and text, and it does it sort of in a locale specific way, in that we can, as I said, we can introduce these formatting expressions so that monetary amounts, for example, are formatted nicely based on the locale that we're currently in. So that's we looked at draft. We first looked at parse, which does essentially text to data. Then we looked at draft, which does data to text. The last thing that we can do, which as I said, is optional, is that we can start to write, we can start to try to capture the logic of this template. And we do that by writing Ergo code. And Ergo is a functional domain-specific language that's very productive for capturing the sorts of logic that you'll often find in contracts. Now, I admit I did not go through the whole exercise of building the executable version of this. I started it, and then I read a couple of the other submissions, and I thought, you know what, I'm not going to get this done in an hour, and I put it down. But I think I will continue it because I'm just curious to see what it ends up looking like. But it is a programming language. You're not going to get a nice kind of decision table, decision tree sort of representation. You will get a much more technical looking representation. But I've made a start. We have this hourly usage clause. You can send it a usage report and you get a usage response. And again, those things are modeled types. So a usage report has got 3 numbers in it essentially, and a usage response has got 3 numbers in it. And if I type Cicero, Cicero trigger, it's basically going to send this sample usage report into the logic of the template and run that logic. So Cicero trigger. So given this request, we get this response with the 3 tiers. And as I said, some people find this super useful because it allows you to package your data model, your natural language, and your logic in a single artifact and version it. Other people don't write the logic at all because what they're really interested in doing is just capturing what those variables are and being able to extract them easily and manage them. and flow them to downstream systems, which I think is where potentially there's some kind of synergy with decision management. So, you know, even if you didn't want to capture this logic using Ergo, you know, maybe because you wanted to use the decision table and you wanted to expose it to the business directly, it might be really useful for the decision table to take, you know, those variables that we saw from pass as input. So your decision table is then being parameterized by the data that's actually in the contract. So you prevent this sort of swivel chair business process problem that we see a lot of, where you have the legal contract, which is a PDF, then you have the back office systems, and there's some sort of human being that's swivel chairing and typing in the contract terms from the PDF into the back office system, which could be a decision table. And that's where a lot of discrepancies slip in, which can be quite problematic. I just wanted to show you one last thing, just very, very quickly putting my Clause hat on. Not to sell you anything, but just to give you a sort of sense for what the open source technology can look like when it comes together in a vendor product. And Clause is just one of the vendor products in the Accord project space. But essentially, what happens is you upload this template to a vendor product, and within Clause, our contract editor then looks something like this, where we can have kind of arbitrary natural language text with those embedded clauses, which are instances of templates, more natural language text, and then other types of templates. So in this case, I've added 2 signature blocks, one for the vendor and one for the customer. And when I edit this clause, perhaps I'll change the effective date. Let's make this not the 30th, the 23rd. So I can either edit here on the left, kind of in the natural language, and you can see that the effective date was updated on the right, or I can edit on the right. So perhaps we want the number of free units for this customer to be 10,000. So essentially we're going to redraft based on that data. And now we have 10,000 units free here. Or perhaps, we, for whatever reason, tier 1, the rate is going to be 0.05, but we're not going to use dollars. We're going to use good old British pounds. So let me find GBP. It gets redrafted, and because we had that locale specific formatting instruction, hopefully you can see that this is now a pound symbol here. And then finally we send this out for signature. And I won't go through the whole process, but the goal is to get the, as I said, to break down that silo so that the natural language text that people are actually signing, the thing that you'll go to court if there's a discrepancy in, is the same as the data that's flowing to the back office systems. So here you can see the smart clause has been rendered in kind of a very plain format, so that it appears to the recipient to be just natural language text. The signature blocks have been mapped into DocuSign signature fields and then can be sent for signature. So the recipients will feel like they're signing just a standard contract, but behind that contract you've done all this digitization work so that at signature you have kind of reliable data, verifiable data that you can flow to your back office systems, which, as I said, could be a decision table or something else. So I will stop there and be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you. And you have the first question from Bob Moore. You can see it on
oh yes,
Slack.
excellent.
So you can read.
Yeah, so yes, it does. Right now we support range constraints on numbers and regex constraints on strings. And you can also have enumerated types. So, you know, if you've got domains of values, which is very common, you can do that kind of thing.
The specific kind of constraint I was thinking of with regard to the particular kind of contracts we've been looking at as an example would be things more like saying that the tier levels have got to go up because it wouldn't make sense for tier 2 to have a lower threshold than tier 1 kind of thing. I mean, it's one of those sorts of things that in contracts like this, where someone can mistype something, you know, if you're kind of doing it manually, you can quite often get these things mistyped, yeah, and it can cause all sorts of problems if nobody spots it. So I was just sort of thinking of that kind of constraint rather than things like, I mean, obviously having domain constraints and regex constraints are useful, but it was really kind of
no, we don't have that today. I think that would require some sort of higher level artifacts.
Yes, as I say, it was really just a sort of the first thing that I looked at and I thought, this is the sort of thing that people mess up. So I thought, just
and yeah, that sort of missing row analysis, gap analysis on decision tables is super useful. It's something that.
Well, it was really more about if you're doing contract clauses, and you're doing a template, so it's a template for a contract. You know, you're going to do multiple versions of this. So I mean, you know, something like a contract like this, you'd expect the SaaS provider to be sending out hundreds or, you know, thousands of these things. So they'd like to have something built into the template so that they can say, we know that the ones that we're sending out are at least going to be self-consistent.
Yeah, it would be. It would be fairly straightforward to, given that JSON, which represents the tiers, to validate it. That's another approach, right? It probably depends whether you want that validation to happen at edit time, or somewhere between edit time and signature. But I mean, you're quite right. You could also imagine kind of having a native Accord table with those kinds of, you know, higher level checking built in, but we haven't got that today.
Okay. More questions? Then I want to ask you, from decision management point of view, logic, business logic is the most interesting part for all of us. And while we live in decision service world today, when everything deployed as services or microservices, I wonder, it's not how we can integrate your tool with, you mentioned already, any decision tables or other representation of logic, not necessarily in Ergo, that's probably just another programming language, and we want to use, let's say, IBM ODM or Open Rules and Rules, and and we can orchestrate different services. So what, can you just provide your comments on this orchestration?
Yeah. So you know, a big part of what Clause does is we give people technology to connect to these contracts to the real world. So that basically involves providing RESTful endpoints for these contracts, or allowing people to essentially write schedules so that they can pull data into the contracts. So within Clause, we have a very rich framework called flows that allows us to call any essentially RESTful endpoint and incorporate the response into the flow or the template logic. So you could definitely imagine a scenario in which something happens in the outside world that the contract cares about, and either before or after you send that event to the template, you call a decision service that's, implemented using any technology, including, some of the ones you mentioned. And then that just becomes another input to the logic that you've written in Ergo, if you have Ergo logic. So that could work really well, I think, for cases where actually the logic it's kind of an implementation detail, or somehow it's private. It's not expressed in the contract. So that's often the discussion that I end up having is, are you trying to capture sort of business process which isn't expressed in the contract, or are you trying to describe contractual obligations? That's sort of where I tend to draw the line, right? If you're basically doing some sort of eligibility check, that's not going to be expressed typically in the contract, or often won't be. And therefore it makes total sense to have a sort of a private decision service that you're running on your side of the contractual agreement that does that sort of eligibility checking. Whereas these unit pricing tiers, they clearly do create a contractual obligation between the two parties, and therefore they have to be expressed in the contract. And that's quite a different sort of challenge, I think.
I understand that you don't even pretend that you do natural language understanding. You require a template created, and right now you mentioned that business logic is not there. It should be written. But human who reads this PDF document understands this logic is already there, right? And it requires somebody else to interpret this logic in a special tool like Ergo or any decisioning platform, and to be called as a services. I also just wonder one more thing. When I looked on your templates, they remind me just Microsoft document with bookmarks. And what you had these variables inside your templates, they're very, very similar to Microsoft bookmark language. And it was used for many, many years. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, or what is the difference between your approach and traditional Microsoft Word.
I'm not aware of Microsoft bookmarks. No, I've not used that.
Microsoft Word bookmarks look exactly like your template language.
Okay.
Very, very similar.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, there are only so many ways of solving this problem, right? I think the challenge that the legal folks have, right? If you look at the responses to that challenge, which I really liked, I thought it was a great challenge, because all companies pretty much now have this pay-as-you-go pricing challenge, and as soon as you allow pricing to be negotiated, you then end up with this issue. And most people want pricing to be negotiable, because that's how you close the big deals, right? But the problem is that this is the sort of language you're going to find in the contract, and that is very, very different to the even the decision tables that we see in some of these solutions. So how can we bridge from one to the other so that the contract that I sign is a faithful representation of the data that ended up in the decision table? So maybe there's something there we can kind of collaborate on, or something, to think about what would that bridge look like, if we could build it.
Yeah, that's bridge. It's a good word, and probably it's very good if you can integrate Accord with some existing decisioning platforms, and we can have an example of this bridge. Even if you would like to complete this example you said, when you do it with Ergo, I'm volunteering to work with you on this integration, and I'm sure Caroline from Sparkling Logic will do the same, and many other people. Bob Moore has his own solution. It would be interesting to be integrated.
Yeah, I think the particular example we're looking at is interesting because it's actually the contractual aspect. So the statement of what the constraints are is actually much simpler than building a solution to it. And it's actually quite interesting that the specification of the problem is really very simple and unambiguous. But when you actually try to build it, because I mean, Jacob originally set this because his team had some problems trying to build a system which supported them. But the statement is very crystal clear. It's the implementation of it.
Well, it kind of sucked me in. I started implementing it, and I got about 15 minutes in. I was like, "Oh,
it's not as easy as it looks."
Yeah.
oh no!" And then I cracked open some of the solutions, and I was like, "Okay, I'm not going to get this done for today."
No, certainly not. Okay. Good.
But yeah, I think you're spot on. I mean, it's, you know, we want to use the right tool for the right job, right? And it's not realistic to think that the solutions can be verbalized as legal text. I don't think, you know, because very different levels of abstraction, right?
Okay. Anybody else has questions? Okay. Dan, before we let you go, I just wonder, based on your experience, what's happening with the blockchain movement? Is it still as active as it was 3 years ago? Because you're not mentioning this at all, and you did not mention this in your presentation 2 years ago on DecisionCAMP. What is your take on this?
Well, yeah, it's still active. I think a lot of the you know, the noise and hype has gone out of it, which is healthy. A lot of the speculators have moved on, which is wonderful. But I think the most active projects I know are, you know, they're consortia essentially, right? They're 5, 6, 7, 8 companies working in competition to essentially build a utility. So that makes it really hard for, you know, a small company like mine to get involved with those sorts of projects. So the most active projects I know of are run by, you know, SAP, IBM, Microsoft, you know, the big consultancy firms, because they have the resources to put, you know, 50 architects on a 3-year project, which is typically what you're talking about. It's kind of really fundamental business transformation stuff. So that's been a big challenge. And then the other sort of fairly obvious in hindsight realization that we had was that the act of digitizing the contract and the act of deploying that contract to blockchain are fairly orthogonal. You know, you can get a lot of the value out of, you can capture a lot of the value by digitizing the contract, and then you decide where you want to deploy the contract. Do you want to run it on Amazon? Do you want to share it with a counterparty and run it on a distributed ledger? So we have tried to sort of decouple those two things, because for most companies, like going from like PDFs and DocuSign to some contracts running on a distributed ledger, that's just a huge leap. And most companies can't make that leap in one go. So they need to sort of first think about, well, what are their data models? How do they digitize their contracts? And then they should think about, you know, building a consortium with their members.
It's still very interesting to have blockchain in real projects, because they can deliver trusted sources of data to make decisions, and it's part of this network of services, and very valuable part. Maybe we should invite somebody from IBM blockchain division to talk about some practical results next time.
Yeah,
anyway,
I mean, it saddens me a little bit, because essentially what's happening is that people are writing all that business logic in Go and Java and, you know, other general purpose programming languages. I think once we get through like the infrastructure and the consortium building phase, I suspect we're going to have to do a second pass at all of those applications and think about who's maintaining the the logic, what's the agility of the solutions, what's the change cycle, and then, you know, decision management and rules and those technologies will probably come to the fore again. But unfortunately, like usual in our industry, they've kind of, you know, they've done the hard thing first, which is just, let's just write loads and loads of code and see what happens.
Okay, then thank you very much for a nice presentation. And we already have somebody scheduled for next month. You can check on the decision management website. And if somebody wants to present on one of the future sessions, please let me know, and we will arrange this. And then good luck with your development. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.